I do want to say thank you to Kim Diana, who has been through this whole process incredibly flexible. Thank you for being so adaptable. She found out this morning at 10:15 that she's doing the reading, for example. I'd like to start by sharing a story. I became a Unitarian Universalist in the early 1990s, and when I joined a small church in my neighborhood in Boston, Massachusetts, in Jamaica Plain. And in that church was a young family, a couple with two little girls, and a few years after I joined, the mother was diagnosed with breast cancer. The church sprang into action, providing food and rides and childcare and cleaning their house right down to scrubbing their toilets. But unfortunately, the mother never recovered. It was heartbreaking. And a month or so after her funeral, her husband was back at the church, and the little girls were back in religious education. And during the service, the husband got up to speak, and this always chokes me up. He began to weep, and he did his best to thank the congregation for all that they had done. And he concluded by saying, "You are God's people, and your hands are God's hands." Now, as you use, we need to translate that God language into words that work best for our own personal theologies. And I like to think that what he said meant, you are love's people, and your hands are love's hands. So however we receive that story in our hearts, it's a story about the power of congregations at their very best. I grew up in a large suburban Roman Catholic church, not to name any names, probably drive by it fairly often. And the congregation, honestly, there felt very corporate, like there was a transaction going on. It felt like a large group of individuals who were punching their communion ticket every Sunday. As for folks who may not be familiar with Roman Catholicism, part of the Sunday service is lining up to receive a thin wafer of communion and from the priest or the deacon. And I particularly love the folks who would get up to receive communion, and instead of going back to their seats, would just keep on going right out the door to beat the rush to the parking lot, even though the service was very much not over. So, later, God. This is an example of a consumerist church, and it may have changed a lot since then, so I don't want to imply anything about how it is now. But a consumerist church, these are places where, and this is a concept that applies across all denominations. Consumerist church have a variety of definition, but I'm thinking of a church where there's a kind of transaction between the individual congregant and the lay and ordained leadership of the church. So this is where a person comes to a service to get their little fix of piety and maybe make a donation, but that is the extent of the relationship. One of the most glaring examples is the person who reads through the sermon topics ahead of time and decides whether or not to attend the service based on the blurb. And I wonder how many people read through and saw that I was preaching, just opted out. Wouldn't surprise me. So this makes it like choosing a movie to watch on Netflix rather than allow oneself to be carried in the current of the larger church. In a non-consumerist church, folks come to a place where they are open to being changed by what they hear. Open to being changed by what they hear. They understand their commitment to each other. They understand that their membership in the church calls them to be in relationship with other congregants, to see them as whole people, and to love them even if they don't like them. To love the people even if they don't like them. And they understand that a congregation is an act of open-hearted creation, co-creation. So just like the sun and the soil and the water and the bugs co-create a garden, we co-create a religious community where we all show up and do our part. So just to be fair, there are Roman Catholic churches with congregations of deeply caring and committed people, despite the sexism and the homophobia of the theology. In fact, there was a Catholic church in Albuquerque where I would get that same kind of feeling of a church that was non-consumerist. A few years ago, they put up a nativity scene before Christmas, like many churches do. You know, the traditional Mary and Joseph and baby Jesus. But the church put them inside a chain link fence as a commentary about how this country treats migrants. And it was powerful. The diocese was not amused and forced them to take it down after a few weeks. But the point was made. Father Vincent, love that guy. So why are religious communities important, especially in this day and age where it seems like we're being pushed to the side? I say even in the most calm of times, being a part of a religious community enhances our lives. That's not saying that being a member is easy. You know, one thing I often say to new members is that the church will break your heart. The institution doesn't set out to do that, but we bring the most unguarded places in our hearts to this place, and it is, at the end, a human institution. Human, and flawed, and messy, and potentially heartbreaking. It's what we do after our hearts break that keeps us in that church. So regardless, life is hard. Every life is hard in its own way. We all need healing. And this is a place where that might happen. My former seminary president, Lee Barker, used to say, church is for suckers. But you know what? We're all suckers. He's not saying that we're all dumb people waiting to be duped. He's saying that each of us is good, as we are, and we could also use a little work. And that's one of the benefits of church in normal times. But these are not normal times. Stating the obvious, these are challenging, dangerous times, and I'm fully convinced that things will get worse. But one of the things that will buffer us as we go through this time is a strong church community. We need to prepare ourselves to look out for the most vulnerable among us, and also the most vulnerable in our communities. We need to prepare ourselves to take care of each other. So this isn't the first time that Unitarian Universalists have had to step up on behalf of the oppressed. And I want to tell you a story. I'm reading an article from the UU World magazine. It's important to stay hydrated while you're preaching. On a snowy night in Prague in 1939, Martha Sharp jumped from a taxi, darted around a corner, and flattened herself into a doorway. The heels of a pursuing Gestapo agent clicked past her. She entered an unlit apartment building, dashed up 5 flights of stairs, and rang the bell of a known anti-Nazi leader. 6 weeks earlier, Martha and her husband, the Reverend Waitstill Sharp, had left their young children safely behind in the United States so they could volunteer for a relief effort in Czechoslovakia. This was sponsored by the American Unitarian Association, which is the precursor to the UUA. Then one night in 1939, the Nazi army marched into Prague, which is the capital of Czechoslovakia, and they occupied the city. The helping mission of the Sharps instantly changed into a treacherous cloak and dagger situation. So that night, a woman opened the apartment door to Martha, denying that she had heard of the man Martha was asking for. "I begged," Martha recounted to a man who was writing a story of her biography. "I told her there was little time. I produced my American passport. When she saw it, she said in Czech, 'A moment,' and then snatched my passport from me and shut the door in my face." For the next few minutes, Martha frantically worried whether she'd see her passport again. Her passport was her only ticket to safety. But the door did open, and this time a man stood before her. Martha asked if he was Mr. X, as Martha later referred to him when she told the story. He said he could give Mr. X a message. And she said she had been charged by a group of British and American refugee workers with transporting him to the British embassy so he could be smuggled from the country. The man asked her to wait a moment, then disappeared into the apartment. He opened the door again wearing an overcoat. He handed Martha her passport and said, "I am Mr. X." Together they walked through the wind and snow across the city. A Nazi soldier stopped them when they reached a bridge over the Vatva River, and Martha produced her passport and confidently announced, "Americans!" They were waved across the bridge, then stopped by another soldier on the other side, and the passport trick worked again. Just steps outside the British embassy, a third Gestapo officer stopped them. Martha began to loudly complain of the lack of taxis and her frustration at being late for a meeting with the embassy secretary. She flashed her passport and demanded the guard tell the secretary, "Mr. and Mrs. Sharp are here." She waved them ahead to speak with a British guard, and Martha and Mr. X walked into the embassy to safety. Martha then returned to her apartment, where Waitstill was returning from a similar mission. They watched out their windows as Nazi soldiers looted Prague stores and warehouses. So the rescue of Mr. X is one of the hundreds that the couple orchestrated, helping Jews and non-Jews, intellectuals, political leaders, writers, artists, and children flee to safety from the Nazis. And in 1940, they established what is now known as the UU, the Unitarian Universalist Service Committee, which is one of the world's leading voices for international justice and human rights. So that was some brave cloak and dagger action, but I want to emphasize that while the Sharps were undeniably courageous, they succeeded because they were part of a larger organization, and it is the group efforts that matter. So who needs rescuing today? Who's in danger? Who needs protection? Right now, who doesn't? Migrants, anyone with a uterus, trans folks, the poor, the list goes on and on. Sometimes people talk about what they would have done if they had been in Germany in the 1930s. Us today, we don't need to speculate. We can show what we do right now. So how do we do that? As bad as things are, it's hard to be clear about exactly what the future holds. In fact, if there's anything the last 9 years have taught us, is that whatever the future is, we're going to be surprised. So we have to prepare for the unknown by practicing being a community of mutual aid. Now, what do I mean by this term, mutual aid? And I want to share a definition created by Joel Islar. Mutual aid is when everyday people get together to meet each other's needs. And they do that with the shared understanding that the systems we live in are not meeting our needs, and that we can meet them together right now without having to pressure power structures to do the right thing. Mutual aid is not charity, but the building of new social relations where people give what they can and get what they need, outside of these unjust systems of power. Mutual aid is a core component of who we are as humans. It's a way of living. It is moving beyond the idea that we should compete for resources and depend on structures of power to provide for us when we are actually capable of doing that together. Now, I know that this church has a justice advocacy team and a clothing ministry and a little free pantry. I'm actually jealous of that. I always wanted to get that going in Albuquerque. These works are developing and supporting our own networks of generosity, and this is practice for a difficult future. We're practicing through these programs how to do mutual aid for the future. Because we need warriors and advocates and cooks and caretakers and poets and musicians and so much more. A couple years ago, I bought a house in New Mexico with a very depleted backyard, and in a moment of irrational enthusiasm, I ordered 28 cubic yards of mulch and compost to improve the soil in my backyard. I actually had no idea. I'm not a gardener at all. I had no idea how much that really was. So imagine my surprise when I received not one, but 2 dump truck loads into my driveway, entirely filled the driveway. And I knew I had bit off way more than I could chew. And I started the long process of bringing it all to my backyard, 1 wheelbarrow full at a time. And I did as much as I could, which was not much, and then I called it a day. And that evening, my doorbell rang, and there was a man there with this adorable puppy he was holding. And the man said, "I see that you have an enormous job to do. I'm in between jobs, and I'd like to help you out, and I'm not looking for money. I just want to be a good neighbor. Well, that guy, he worked for the next 5 days in the heat, schlepping compost and mulch. He pretty much did the whole job by himself. Each and every day I begged him to take some money, and he constantly refused. And on the last day, I tried one more time to pay him, and I got a little pushy, and he just looked at me and said, "Why don't we just leave it for God's eyes?" So I told a colleague that story, and she said to me, "Sometimes people are angels without realizing that they are angels. Sometimes people are angels without realizing they are angels." Are any of those folks in our midst today? I bet they are. The times ahead are going to challenge us individually and as a community. We're going to need angels, we're going to need Martha Sharps, and we're going to need to be the hands of love or God or the divine. We're going to need all of us suckers pulling together and looking out for each other and looking out for the most vulnerable among us. I believe that our Unitarian Universalist faith will carry us through, and I believe in this religious community. I believe in you. Amen, and blessed be.